All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's officially noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon for PHRC's Fair Housing and Power Hour. We hold this series every month. It's always on a Wednesday at noon, typically the last Wednesday of the month, but with the holiday, we're doing it a little bit earlier this month. My name is Brittany Mellinger. I'm the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and I'm going to be your presenter today. I'd like to address a few housekeeping items before we jump into the presentation. First of all, I do want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded. We are recording and we will be sending out the recording following the presentation. We will also send out the slides from today's presentation. So you'll be able to access those links and those materials and this information after we're finished. It typically goes out within the next week. I do want to thank our ISL interpreters, Hetty and Julie, for their services today, as well as our captioner, Fenella, for making this program accessible. And I want to thank my colleague, Caroline Eister, who's PHRC's Director of Fair Housing Commercial Property, for providing technical assistance and assisting with the program today. These programs truly are a team effort. I'd invite folks to introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't had the opportunity to do so already. It's always great to see who's joining us and where you're joining us from. So let's go ahead and get started. So fair housing is the right of all Pennsylvanians. We know that housing opportunities are crucial for thriving communities. So at the Human Relations Commission, we put a strong emphasis on making sure that everyone is aware of their rights and responsibilities so that we can advance fair housing opportunities together. I'd like to go over our training goals today. So we're going to start off by providing a general overview of who we are as an agency. We're going to talk about relevant fair housing protections, discuss discriminatory acts before we move from the general fair housing space into our specific topic today. So looking at housing discrimination issues that face individuals from other countries. We will close out by providing an overview of the complaint process, as well as by leaving some time to answer your fair housing questions. So if you have questions, you are welcome to pop them into the chat and ask them throughout the presentation. I will also be inviting you to provide feedback in the chat. So please don't close out your chat box, but you can also save your questions until the end if you're more comfortable with that as well. So starting off with an overview of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We are the state's leading civil rights enforcement agency. We've been around since 1955, and we have a two-part mission. So first off, we enforce our state's non-discrimination laws. That includes both the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, as well as the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. So if an individual believes that they've experienced discrimination in Pennsylvania, whether it's in their housing, their employment, commercial property, in a public accommodation, or in their education, they can contact our agency, file a complaint, and have a neutral investigator look into the situation to see if there is a violation of our state law. But beyond enforcing our laws as complaints come in, we also work proactively to promote equal opportunity for everyone in Pennsylvania. So we do this in a wide variety of forms. We do this through different online programs. We actually have one following today's Fair Housing and Power Hour at 1 o'clock. We'll have a virtual lunch and learn featuring our guest presenter today, Bill Flagg, who is going to be talking about a settlement that impacts home buying opportunities for minority home buyers. So I'd really encourage you to take a look at that today. If you have the time, I'm going to put the link in the chat here in case anyone hasn't registered yet and would like to attend that. We host a wide variety of virtual events as well as in-person conferences and events and things like that to provide resources about equal opportunity for everyone in Pennsylvania. We also do this in partnership with our advisory councils and social justice ambassadors, which are volunteers that help our agency to be able to accomplish our mission and connect with local communities. If you're interested in getting involved with those efforts, please reach out to me. I'll have my contact information at the end of the presentation and I'd be happy to get you connected with those efforts. We serve the entire state of Pennsylvania through 3 regional offices. So the western part of our state is served by our Pittsburgh regional office. The central part of the state up into the northeast is covered by our Harrisburg regional office. And then the southeastern part of the state is covered by our Philadelphia regional office. So these are the members of our team that work to do intake, to accept complaints, investigate complaints, and so forth. We also have a central office that's also located in Harrisburg that does a lot of the outreach and administrative functions as well for the agency. I mentioned our laws just a moment ago, and I want to provide a little bit more of a detailed breakdown of what they cover. So you can see on the screen here that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act really does a lot of the heavy lifting and covers the bulk of the subject areas that we cover. So that covers employment, housing, commercial property, public accommodations, such as public services and restaurants and public spaces, as well as primary and secondary education up and through high school. The Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act covers post-secondary education, such as colleges, trade schools, and technical schools. But from here, we're going to pivot on to talk about our fair housing laws specifically. Before I advance to the next slide, I'd like to invite you to put in the chat. We're going to be talking about the goals of fair housing. So I'd love to hear from you. What do you believe the goals of fair housing are? What do our fair housing laws do, and what are they seeking to accomplish? I always like to take advantage of the wisdom of the group. We've got a bunch of folks joining us today on this presentation, and I encourage you to join your voice to the conversation by putting any ideas that you have about what the goals of fair housing are. All right, prevent and act on discrimination in housing. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that input. That is absolutely right. And I encourage anyone else who has thoughts to go ahead and put that in the chat while I advance to the next slide. So when we look at the goals of fair housing, we typically look at 2 goals. So the first one is to end housing discrimination, making sure that discriminatory acts and policies aren't keeping anyone out of housing opportunities. But we also have a second goal, which is to promote diverse, inclusive communities. We call that affirmatively furthering fair housing. And that's defined as taking meaningful action in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. So acknowledging that our country has had a problematic history in terms of our laws and our practices and our policies, which have led to segregated communities and unequal opportunities. And we need to take focused and proactive efforts to address this, so that way everyone can take advantage of diverse, inclusive communities that have the opportunities that we all want to live in thriving communities. We often put a lot of emphasis on goal number 1, but I don't think that we put enough emphasis and action on goal number 2. So we always try to mention both of these goals, even though today we're going to be practically focusing primarily on goal number 1. We have our fair housing laws listed here, and there's a couple different layers of fair housing laws. So at the federal level, there's the Fair Housing Act of 1968, as well as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So the second 2 laws provide additional protections for individuals with disabilities. At the state level, as I mentioned earlier, our fair housing law is the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act that our agency, the Human Relations Commission, enforces. But there's also fair housing laws at the local level through local ordinances. There are over 70 different local ordinances throughout Pennsylvania. So I'd encourage you to pop in the chat if you're familiar with a local Human Relations Commission or a local ordinance that that provides fair housing protections. I'd love to hear about that. I think we have at least one member from a local Human Relations Commission on the line, as I saw in the introductions, and it's always great to see which local ordinances are present where we have our attendees joining us from. And I highlight these various levels of protections because there are often different protections in different areas. So we'll cover the differences between the federal and state protections, both in terms of jurisdiction as well as protected classes. And there may be even further protections at the local level. So it's important to maintain awareness of your local protections as well as the federal and the state. So what do our fair housing laws cover? They cover the sale and the rental of housing, as well as housing-related transactions. So when I say housing-related transactions, I'm talking about all of the industries that can surround housing and can influence housing opportunities. So such as mortgages, appraisals, insurance. These industries and businesses that can impact the availability of housing opportunities. The types of housing that are covered by our fair housing laws are broad. So it's anything from apartments to single-family homes to manufactured housing communities, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. So some types of shelters are even covered by our fair housing laws. And I want to highlight two discrimination theories or types of discrimination. So the first one that I want to focus on is disparate treatment. And we define that as a treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. So looking at our featured topic today, national origin protections, that could look like people with a different country of origin are denied rental housing, while people who are born in the United States are able to rent those units. So it's treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class because of that protected class. Disparate impact can be a little bit more subtle. It might not be as in your face. So it's a policy that looks neutral on its face, but it has a disproportionate or a disparate impact on members of a protected class. So looking at a policy of a housing provider, if they would require someone to have a social security number, that could have a disparate impact on someone based on their national origin. So depending on citizenship or immigration status, someone may not have a social security number. So alternative identification documents should be utilized in the screening process. So our landlords and housing providers, property managers should be cautious when they're working with third-party screening vendors to make sure that their policies are not having disparate impact. Before I advance to the next slide to show you our protected classes at the federal and the state level, I'd love to invite folks who are on this call to put any protected classes that you're aware of in the chat at this point. So I'd love to see if we can utilize the wisdom of the group to come up with all of our protected classes at the federal and the state level, if you all are up for it. All right, sex, absolutely. Race, yes. Any others? Disability, age 40 and above. Religion, yeah, absolutely. What else? National origin, yeah. Familial status. Gender identity is covered under the protected class of sex. Ancestry, you all are doing great. And shout out to my colleagues at PHRC who are putting a bunch in as well. Disability, absolutely. Religion, Yeah, GED, abortion, sterilization. All right, let me go ahead and we'll flip to the next screen and see if we missed any. So there are 7 protected classes under the Fair Housing Act at the federal level. So those are race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. So I think we got all 7 of those. You can see in the right-hand column under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act that it really closely mirrors that, but we do add on 3 additional ones. So we've got age 40 and above, ancestry, as well as the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. So I did see that we've got a couple folks that are joining us from out of state, so you might want to check your state act as well to see if your protections might look a little different at the state level. But in Pennsylvania, these are our protected classes, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail about a few of these. So the first one that we're going to look at is familial status. And that's defined as families with children under the age of 18 who are living with their parents or legal custodians. It also includes people who are pregnant, as well as people who are securing custody of children under the age of 18, which also includes foster children. So sex is a protected class under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. You didn't see LGBTQ listed or sexual orientation, gender identity as separate protected classes on that slide that I had on the screen just a moment ago. But we do have those protections because we recently finalized regulations in August of last year, and those further define the protected class of sex. And they establish that sex may refer to pregnancy status, childbirth status, breastfeeding status, sex assigned at birth, gender identity or expression, affectional or sexual orientation, as well as differences in sex development. So at the PHRC, we use these regulations as we accept complaints, conduct investigations, as well as adjudicate cases. And you can find more details on these regulations at the link on the screen. We also have a fantastic fact sheet with additional information because we are trying to get the word out there about these protections. We know that these are not separate protected classes, so there may be less awareness that that folks have these protections, and we want to make sure that all Pennsylvanians are aware of these protections as well. I'd also like to highlight disability, which is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. So some examples of this impairment that would substantially limit one or more of these major life activities include caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, or working. This isn't an exhaustive list, it's just some examples. And as you can tell from this list, these could be disabilities that you would immediately observe as you would interact with someone in a rental situation, as someone's filling out a lease application or coming into a leasing office, or might be inquiring about buying a home, or it might be something that's non-observable that you wouldn't know until it's disclosed, regardless of whether the disability is observable or non-observable. Someone that would have these physical or mental impairments would qualify for disability protections under our fair housing laws. And our fair housing laws protect those who have a disability, those who have a history of a disability, as well as those who are regarded as having a disability. So sometimes I get questions like, of course, the first one makes sense. Those who have a disability would have disability-related protections. But why would someone who doesn't currently have a disability but has a history of a disability, or who's regarded as having a disability, why would they have these protections? And the answer to that is because someone could treat them differently, could limit their housing opportunities based on that perception of having a disability, or based on their knowledge of a previous condition or a disability, particularly one that has stigma, and that could influence their decision-making as they're choosing whether to grant or to not grant housing. So it's important that all of these three groups do have protections. There are a few exemptions that I would like to highlight, and that includes people who are currently using illegal drugs or controlled substances. They would be exempted from disability-related protections. Now, this does not include those who are in active recovery. So if someone is in active recovery from a controlled substance they are not currently using, they're in recovery, they still would have disability-related protections. But individuals who pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others would be exempt from disability-related protection as well. Now, I'd like to address ancestry and national origin protected classes. They are closely related, but I do want to draw the distinction. So ancestry, this refers to the country that a person's ancestry is from. So it's your family background. So an example, someone with Spanish heritage who's born in the United States. Born in the United States, but their family history and that heritage is from a country outside of the United States. National origin refers to a person's country of origin, so where they were born. So example of this would be a person who immigrated from China or from another country. Now, I do want to note that immigration status does not impact fair housing protections. So regardless of someone's immigration status, they do have fair housing protections in Pennsylvania. And I'd like to move on to discussing some discriminatory actions at this point. So this is not an exhaustive list, but here's a list of discriminatory actions that can limit housing opportunities. So we've got discriminatory statements. So a statement or an advertisement saying that a housing provider will only rent to certain populations, perhaps. Discriminatory inquiries, asking about someone's country of origin as they're applying to rent a home or secure a mortgage. Steering someone to a certain neighborhood based on their national origin, or to a certain part of a rental complex. That could be discriminatory as well. So refusing to sell, lease, or finance housing, providing an unfair appraisal of the value of a home based on someone's protected class. Predatory lending, so offering unfair terms and conditions for a loan based on someone's protected class. Discrimination in the housing terms and conditions, so that could be in the lease, in the housing policies. Everyone should have fair and equal housing terms and not determined by their protected class. Unequal provision of services and facilities, so that could be someone's ability to use the laundry facilities, the common spaces, the pool in a facility, or it could be provision of services such as maintenance services. If there's differences, if some folks have prompt service and repairs, but other folks don't on the basis of protected class, that would be discriminatory. Next, we've got harassment, and we often talk about this in terms of sexual harassment, but there can be harassment on the basis of other protected classes as well, such as someone's national origin or ancestry or disability or age. There unfortunately are a wide variety of different types of harassment that can be discriminatory. And then lastly, there's refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and modifications for individuals with disabilities. And this is specific to individuals with disabilities who would need to have either a change in policy or a change in the physical structure of a building to be able to use and enjoy their housing. So that completes the general overview of fair housing protections. And now we're going to get into more specifics about discrimination and national origin. So we're going to start by talking about what discrimination might look like. And I do want to acknowledge that a lot of this content is sourced from a presentation that was prepared for PHRC by Realm and Colfax several years ago, and it's fantastic information, and I do want to share it with you, but I want to, have that disclaimer as well to give credit where credit is due. So discrimination might look like denial or different treatment because of the physical, cultural, or linguistic characteristics of another country. So it's not just what country you're from, but that can also impact cultural practices. It can impact the language that's spoken and things like that. That's all closely tied in with a national origin. So it can look like denial based on a name. If someone sees a name that they associate with another country and would deny housing on that basis, that would be discriminatory. If there's different terms and conditions that are offered in their housing, whether that's rental housing, buying a home, or securing a mortgage, having citizenship requirements to be able to rent a home. That could be discriminatory, as well as providing unequal services. If you're targeting for predatory loans with poor terms and conditions based on the language that someone speaks, that would be discriminatory, as well as harassment and intimidation, keeping someone from being able to use and enjoy their home because of this behavior and this harassment. Now, it's not always overt. Sometimes there are code words and phrases that are used that could indicate that there's discrimination that's occurring on the basis of national origin. So you can see some phrases on the screen here, such as "go back where you came from." Talking about large families and overcrowding, based on assumptions and stereotypes. This could be a code word or a phrase that would indicate discrimination. When you're talking about using single-family homes as multifamily dwellings or failing to maintain property, as well as talking about letting children roam the streets. I want to talk next about documentation, since this is an area where we often get questions that come up in training settings. So housing providers should not have requirements that all tenants need to have a social security number, the ITIN, that's the individual taxpayer identification number, a birth certificate, or a passport. Why? Because these are things that folks from different national origins may not have, depending on what their citizenship status is or their immigration status. So housing providers should make sure that they've got alternative ways that they can qualify and screen tenants for housing to be able to avoid disparate impact issues. Of course, housing providers are able to make sure that folks have the credit history that they need for their property, but they should be able to use alternative documentation to be able to establish that. And they can generally forgo credit checks for potential residents as long as they're not discriminating based on a protected characteristic or protected class, specifically, and treating a group of folks differently on the basis of their protected class. Next, I'd like to discuss language. So language and limited English proficiency are issues that we see come up with in association with national origin. Now, of course, not everyone from other countries speaks languages other than English, but it is something that can come up, and if housing providers are not providing appropriate translation services, that can substantially limit housing opportunities for folks that speak languages other than English. So I want to distinguish between housing providers that generally operate on the private market and don't receive funding from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, as well as those who are receiving that funding from HUD. So individuals who do receive this funding, they are required to provide translation services for vital documents, interpret meetings when there are larger populations of non-English speakers, as well as to prepare a language assistance plan to make sure that their housing is accessible and that they can be able to, and that individuals who speak other languages have housing opportunities as well. Now, housing providers that don't receive this funding don't have that same requirement, but it is a best practice for all landlords to provide translated documents and translation for important meetings when it's feasible upon request. It's best for all parties when everyone understands the lease agreements and other policies, really important things that can impact communication between landlords and tenants. So there may be community organizations that are willing to partner with housing providers to be able to offer these services. And that may be an opportunity to reduce the cost burden for providing this service. But there is a clear benefit in making sure that everyone can understand the terms of their lease and understand the policies of a housing provider. All right, next I'd like to address neighbor-to-neighbor harassment, looking at interference, coercion, or intimidation. We can see the language from the Fair Housing Act here. It shall be unlawful to coerce, intimidate, threaten, or interfere with any person in the exercise or enjoyment of, or on account of his having exercised or enjoyed, or on the account of his aided or encouraged any other person in the exercise or enjoyment of, or any right granted or protected by Section 3603, 3604, 3605, or 3606 of this title. And you can see there are links here on the screen if you'd like to get more details of this. But in terms of more practical examples, we can see harassment looking like verbal comments and or slurs that happen from neighbor to neighbor on the basis of national origin. If there's threats to personal safety, threats to report a household to immigration and customs enforcement, or defacing of their property. This is not acceptable, and this can limit someone's ability to be able to use and enjoy their housing. So a housing provider should address this harassment when they're aware of it happening, whether it's happening from neighbor to neighbor or even from a staff member, from an owner, from an outside vendor that's on the property. This is not acceptable. And a housing provider should make sure that they're taking reasonable steps to address this and make sure that all tenants can be able to use and enjoy their housing regardless of their protected class. All right, from here, we're going to talk about fair housing complaints and what that complaint process would look like. So if you believe that you've experienced discrimination on the basis of national origin or any of the other protected classes that we've discussed this afternoon, you have the right to file a complaint with our agency. And on this next screen, you can see our contact information. So there are a number of different ways that you can get in contact with our team to be able to file a complaint. You can call us on the phone. You can call our main number, which is 717-787-4410. You can get in touch with one of our regional offices, depending on where you live and what part of Pennsylvania you're in. We also have a website and an email that you can use to get in touch with us. And you can see that we've got our social media handles on there, our symbols. We're pretty active on social media, but I would really encourage you to reach out to us via email or go on our website for information or contact us by phone to get the complaint process started. Before we talk about the process, I do want to touch on immigration status and fair housing complaints. And I want to let you know that our agency will not ask about immigration status when complaints are filed. So that will not come up at any point in the intake or investigative process, and we will not report anyone who's filing a complaint to U.S. Customs, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And we do provide language access. So if you need service in a different language, we've got telephonic interpretation in a wide host of different languages. So if you need assistance, or if you're working with someone that would need assistance in their primary language, please let us know, and we're happy to make sure that you have those interpretation services when you need them. So you would start with intake. That's the first step in our complaint process. So you would work with one of our intake specialists who will ask you to fill out a housing questionnaire just to provide some basic information about what happened. So your contact information, so that way our team can get in touch with you, what you experienced, as well as the person or the agency, organization, the company that you're filing a complaint against. And our intake team will work to make sure that this is a situation that we can investigate under our state law. So to make sure that that it pertains to either housing, commercial property, public accommodations, education, or employment, and to make sure that it's timely as well. So it needs to be filed within 180 days of the date of the last harm to be filed with our agency. So as long as the complaint is jurisdictional and it's timely, our intake team will help a complainant to finalize their complaint. And then after that, the person who was filed against would be notified. So just a brief explanation of terminology. We call the person who's filing a complaint the complainant, and we call the person who has a complaint that's filed against them a respondent, since they're responding to the complaint that's filed. At this point, we move into the investigative phase. From there, a neutral investigator will ask them to provide information. Their role is to investigate if there was a violation of our act. So they will do this in a variety of ways. They may ask for documents, they may interview witnesses, they may hold a fact-finding hearing where both parties are together and are asked questions. They may go on site to a property to take a look at the site, or they may seek other ways of obtaining evidence to find out what actually happened in the situation. I want to highlight that our investigators are neutral, so they're not acting on behalf of the complainant or the respondent in this case. Their role is just to see if there's a violation of the law. Folks may receive an invitation to participate in mediation services, depending on the facts of the case, and depending if both parties agree to mediation. That's really crucial to be able to engage in mediation. It's voluntary, but it can be a quicker way to resolve a complaint, and that is completely confidential as well. So there are a lot of benefits to our mediation services. And I want to note that mediation services are just for complaints that are filed with our agency. We don't provide mediation services in other situations aside from the complaints that are filed with our agency. But if mediation services aren't elected, then then the parties will be working with that investigator, who will also explore if it's possible to settle the case before coming to a finding. If the case does proceed to a finding, there are two possible outcomes. So there could be the outcome of probable cause, which means that there is enough evidence to establish that discrimination did occur. Or it may be found that there's no probable cause, which means that there was not enough evidence that that discrimination occurred, so we could not find a probable cause finding. Now, if there's no probable cause, that's pretty much where the case ends. If someone believes that there was significant evidence that was missed, or that there were issues with the process, they can file appeal, but typically that's where it ends. If probable cause is found, the process continues. So the case may be conciliated to see if both parties can come to an agreement. It may advance to a public hearing in front of one of our hearing examiners or our commissioners, or it may be filed in court. So at this point, our agency is no longer neutral because we found probable cause, because that evidence does exist, that discrimination did occur. Our goal is to seek remedy for the discrimination that happened. And a lot of times I get questions in the chat, how long does this process take? And unfortunately, there's just such a wide variation that I can't provide a great answer for you. It really depends on the facts of the case, on the evidence, on how quickly both parties respond, as well as other factors. So there can be significant variation in how long it takes to resolve a case. Folks also typically ask, well, why would I file a complaint? What are the remedies that can actually be achieved by filing a complaint? And there's a number of different remedies that can be achieved through filing a complaint. So in the housing space, this slide is specific to housing, and I do want to note that. There might be a reasonable accommodation or modification that's made, with the impact being that individual with a disability is able to get the changes that they need, whether it's a change to policy or a change to the actual structure of housing, so that way they can use and enjoy their housing. There may be changes to a lease if there's discriminatory clauses or policies in a lease, or even other policies that a housing provider has. This changes will make sure that both the complainant as well as other tenants at that housing complex or that are served by that company, they can all have fair policies, which benefits everyone. There's often a required posting of fair housing notices, so that way folks are aware of their rights and responsibilities. And there's typically training that's required for respondents as well. So that way they can get detailed training to understand their responsibilities under our fair housing laws. So hopefully they are able to avoid any further fair housing mistakes in the future. Sometimes there are monetary remedies as well. So there can be anything from a reimbursement of fees and out-of-pocket expenses that shouldn't have been paid. So for example, if there's an individual with a disability who was charged a pet fee for their emotional support animal, it could be required to have those fees reimbursed to that tenant, since that tenant should not have been required to pay that. Or there could have been out-of-pocket expenses that were associated with the complaint process if they had to drive places and incur other expenses as part of the complaint. Something that's unique to our housing cases that wouldn't be available in our education or employment or public accommodation cases is money for humiliation and embarrassment, which is similar to pain and suffering. So acknowledging the impact that this discrimination has had on the complainant and providing monetary remedy for that. And then lastly, if a case advances to public hearing, there could be civil penalties that are assessed, which is simply money paid to the state, the cost for violating our state law through discriminatory policies and practices and actions. To give you an idea of some of our recent housing awards and what that looks like, you can see there's significant variation, both in terms of the amount of money as well as the basis for the complaint. So to quickly go through these, there was one for $1.5 million, and that's a housing provider that failed to provide accessible units and ignored requests for reasonable accommodations for tenants with disabilities. There's a $100,000 award where a maintenance worker sexually harassed a female tenant. $90,000 where a housing provider revoked a lease and failed to address neighbor-to-neighbor harassment based on race. And then lastly, a $77,000 award where a housing provider made discriminatory statements and refused to rent to a household based on familial status. I want to leave you with some fair housing resources as well for your learning that can help advance your knowledge beyond our time together today. We have the Pennsylvania Fair Housing Line, 855-866-5718. You can call that and you will reach one of our trained staff who will be able to provide you with fair housing information and resources. So whether you're a housing provider or a tenant or someone who simply has a question about fair housing rights and responsibilities, I encourage you to use this line so that way you can access the information you need and get your questions answered. We provide custom fair housing trainings and consultations to a wide variety of groups throughout the Commonwealth. And I would be happy to provide you more information about that if you're interested. We can go much more into depth than what we do in our simply 1 hour training. We can do a much longer and more in-depth one on topics like emotional support animals or hoarding, or affirmatively furthering fair housing, or simply an overview of the fair housing fundamentals. And these are completely free of charge. We do have our monthly Fair Housing and Power Hours. Next month in December, we're going to be talking about protections for LGBTQ Pennsylvanians. So we'll go more in depth into our regulations and the protections that those provide. And then we'll have a whole new set of Fair Housing and Power Hours in the new year as well. If you are interested in getting some information on a specific fair housing topic, we likely have it in our archive as well, and you can access that on our YouTube account, which is linked on the screen here. I mentioned that we do have brochures and fact sheets on our website that you can print out or share as a PDF, or you can even request us to mail those out to you. We want to make sure that we are getting our information out into the community, whether it's listings of our trainings or information about fair housing or education, any of our areas of expertise. You can get that at the link. We also have a program called PHRC Speaks, which airs on PCN, and our 6th season will be airing shortly, the first Sunday in December. So if you get PCN, I'd encourage you to tune in at 3 o'clock for a conversation with one of our hearing examiners. It's an excellent episode, and I encourage you to tune in. But I promised to leave you with some contact information. So we've got our central office here. I will also share my contact information. I see that we've got our Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property on here, but I will send out all the information from my email, so you'll have that as well as our Fair Housing line. I do want to highlight that there's a QR code on your screen. So what I encourage you to do is pull out your phone if you can, and pull up your camera app so that you can access this survey. It only takes a couple minutes. It provides us really great feedback about what you found valuable about this training, what you'd like to see in future trainings, and also you can get a downloadable certificate for your attendance in today's training. So if you're interested in getting some documentation on your pursuit of fair housing knowledge, we're happy to support you with that. And you can click through the survey. You certainly don't have to put any answers that you don't want to put, but you can secure that. You can secure that certificate and download that for your records. I'm also putting the link in the chat if that's an easier way for folks to access that survey. So at this point, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. If anyone has any questions about the content that I covered today, or if they've got other questions about fair housing information, I'm happy to stay on the line and answer any questions that folks have. We've got about 12 minutes. And if there are questions that you'd like to have answered, I'd be happy to answer them now, or you can send me a follow-up email and I can answer them at that point as well. So while folks are thinking of questions, I'd love to invite you, if there was a new piece of information, if there was something that you weren't aware of before, I'd invite you to put that in the chat. If there's something that you found valuable from today's presentation, I'd encourage you to share that feedback with us in the chat, or you can simply do that in the survey as well. All right, I am not seeing any questions in the chat. Thank you for that feedback on the timeliness of this issue. I absolutely agree. It is a timely issue that a lot of folks are talking about. So we are trying to spread the word about these protections so folks know how to file complaints if they believe they've experienced discrimination. I'd like to thank you for spending your lunch hour with me today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll stay on the line for a couple extra minutes, but this is the end of the presentation. So you're welcome to go about the rest of your day as well. And I'd encourage you to join us in a couple minutes at 1 o'clock for our virtual lunch and learn as well, if you're interested in that as well. All right, seeing no questions, I'm going to close us out. So thank you, everyone, and take care.